Did the British government invent communism? If so, why and to what ends? Who did they blame? All that and more. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show. I am your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. We help our clients to combat cancel culture by placing them on the right podcasts and new media. You can check out our brand new Command Your Empire resource at commandyourempire.com. Reminder before we get today's conversation to comment on, like this video, and smash that subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. We have a guest by popular demand back on the show. This is his third time appearing on the show, and gosh, his first appearance had over 100,000 views, and the second one wasn't far behind. So, Richard Poe, welcome back to the show today, sir.
Thanks, Jeremy. Always a pleasure.
So you have a brand new book, which we're actually going to put up on screen here for everybody to see, which we're going to be discussing today. But the title of it is How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. So I'm really excited to dive into this one. I guess, first and foremost, Richard, you've done a lot of research. I guess, how did you, get into this topic in particular? How did you discover this? I know you are an avid researcher.
Well, how did I get into it? Well, I've always been, since I was a kid, I've been interested in the Russian Civil War because my father's parents experienced it. They were both Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire, and they both came here in the early 20s, so they were still in Russia throughout the entire length of the Russian Civil War. And I was always very intrigued about what kinds of experiences they had, and I was always told, don't ask them, they don't like to talk about it, and this kind of thing was this big mystery. So simply because of that family connection, I just had this tremendous curiosity, plus it was a bit of a forbidden subject on some level. And but as I grew older, I studied Russian. I went to school in Russia, became very interested in Russian history. But I also learned fairly early on, I'd say maybe 40 years ago, I started reading revisionist history, alternative authors whom you might call conspiracy authors or revisionist authors. And I noticed there was a very strong undercurrent there that the British had somehow staged the Russian Revolution and had somehow manipulated the Russian Civil War to make sure that the Bolsheviks won. So this is something you don't find in the conventional history books, but it's all over the revisionist history if you expose yourself to that kind of literature. And I've always been intrigued by that sort of thing for since I was young, in my 20s at least. And so this idea has always been sort of in my head. And I just reached a point, I guess, where a lot of strands of my research started coming together. I've been researching color revolutions in particular for the last, let's say, 20 years or so. I wrote a book back in 2006 with David Horowitz called The Shadow Party, which was an expose of George Soros and his involvement in color revolutions. And in my more recent work, I've been continuing that work in articles and so forth. And what I've been discovering is that color revolutions go further and further back in time. For a while, just maybe 3-4 years ago, I wrote an article saying that I think the first color revolution was the Carnation Revolution in 1974 in Portugal. I was very proud of myself that I pushed it back that far. But it suddenly all came together that I realized in the last couple of years that the French Revolution had every aspect of a color revolution, and so did the Russian Revolution. And I started to put it all together and realize that the British were behind it. There is, in fact, tremendous evidence in both cases, both the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, not only that the British instigated these revolutions, but that through their secret services, they expertly manipulated events to disguise what was basically a foreign coup, a coup by a foreign intelligence service, but they disguised it as a people's uprising. And this is exactly what a color revolution is. When you have an uprising which is touted for PR purposes as a spontaneous uprising of the people, but in fact is being perpetrated covertly by usually foreign intelligence services. So it finally all came together in the last couple of years that I realized the French and the Russian revolutions were indeed color revolutions, every bit as much as these more recent events, such as the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the bulldozer revolution in Yugoslavia, and all these post-Soviet events that we've been taught to call color revolutions. But it's really a much older form of regime change and destabilization, in which the British in particular have excelled and specialized and have become the world's leading expert. And in my book, my latest book, I do talk a little bit about how the modern color revolution movement, which we have today, actually was created by the British. It was created by British psychological warfare experts who then taught it to an American named Gene Sharp, who was attending Oxford back in the 1950s and 60s, and he was working with all the top names in British psychological warfare. And he, as his Oxford doctoral thesis, wrote a book which is now known as the Handbook for Color Revolutions. All the color revolution activists and professionals, they read this book, and this American pacifist, so-called Gene Sharp, the late Gene Sharp, he died recently. They tried to portray him as a kind of an activist. They called him as a peace activist, but really he was an intelligence operative, working at the very highest level of British military intelligence and psychological operations, and with the very top experts in that field, being mentored and instructed by them. And what they were teaching him was a centuries-old strategy, which the British have been using at least since the French Revolution. I'm quite sure as I continue to dig, I'm going to find that it goes back even farther. But the upshot of this, in my new thinking, given my newest discoveries, is when I look at the whole age of revolution, as we call it, which basically began, let's say, in the late 18th century and maybe continued through the early 20th century with the Russian Revolution. Through this age of revolution corresponds exactly with the rise of the British Empire to global hegemony. And I don't think that's a coincidence. In my book, I actually call color revolution the British secret weapon. I actually believe now that more than the famous British naval power and even the banking system, perhaps, things that have traditionally been seen as the pillars of British imperial power, I think the expertise they developed in pulling off these color revolutions and basically having this almost miraculous ability to make enemy governments disappear, to vanish into thin air, and to do so in a deniable way where it doesn't appear that the British were the ones who did it. It appears that the people themselves rose up with pitchforks and marched on the Bastille or marched on the Winter Palace in Russia or whatever. But this, I believe, has been such an important tool, such an important weapon in the growth of the British Empire, that I now see the Age of Revolution itself as being a phenomenon which, if it wasn't actually created by the British government, it was thoroughly infiltrated, penetrated, and exploited and manipulated by the British government in such a way that I don't know if there's any revolution that took place during that time that wasn't somehow co-opted and re-engineered and turned in a direction that was advantageous to the British. And this is a tremendous power, which has now, in the present age, has been shared with the Americans through the special relationship. And as with so many things in the Anglo-American relationship, and we've talked about this, Jeremy, in previous interviews, I think part of the British strategy is to use the Americans as a cover for their operations. They teach us their tricks. They teach us their methods that they have used to establish and rule a global empire. And then they let us, in some sense, take the blame for these things. And I think, of course, because we, or at least our government, our elites, have willingly taken part in this permanent alliance with Britain and have willingly allowed the baton to be transferred to us, so that we are now in partnership with what is no longer called the British Empire, but it still obviously is in every real sense. And so this is another aspect of the British strategy, which is to remain hidden, to remain invisible, and not to make a great show of strength, but to work through others, to work through allies, to work through allied groups of one sort or another, and to allow the blame, or most of the blame, to fall on those allies, or to fall on those other people. And this is where the second part of my book comes in, where it says, and how the British invented communism and blamed it on the Jews. So the invention of communism was basically.
Well, can we get to that in just a second? I just want to ask you one follow-up before we get to that, because I know we have one of our YouTube subscribers is often asking questions related to the British Empire. So shout out to Sir Truth out there, who is one of our YouTube subscribers. And I guess the question I would have is, before we get into the title of the book and what we really want to get into today, Richard, the one thing I want to ask is, when we look at kind of modern day, is the British government still employing this strategy now, or is it much of, this special relationship where you talked about, where the U.S. is kind of taking up the mantle in a way?
Oh, absolutely they are. I mean, this is the core of my worldview, or rightly or wrongly, but basically, as I explained in my latest book, that what we call globalism today, I think most people realize that we are facing a force called globalism, which is embodied by institutions such as the World Economic Forum, from which Klaus Schwab just suddenly resigned. We see that these groups have tremendous power over us, and that they seem to represent values and agendas that are quite foreign to us. Well, it is my contention that these groups were set up by the British, often using a great deal of subterfuge and cover stories and cover entities to conceal the British hand behind them. But I believe that the whole infrastructure of what we call globalism today was invented by the British. It was conceived and envisioned by the British back in the 19th century. Going back to the time of Napoleon, we start seeing these elite discussions in Britain about how to rule the world and how to organize the world. how to create a League of Nations, or a peace league, it was usually called. And then much later, 100 years after this was being discussed, we suddenly got the myth that a U.S. President, Woodrow Wilson, supposedly had the bright idea to do a League of Nations. This was a British idea, which was at least a century old by the time Wilson was corralled into doing it. So all of these institutions, all of these ideas, the whole idea of entering into World War I as a war to end wars, this came from H.G. Wells, who was, of course, a famous British science fiction writer and futurist, but he was also an intelligence operative. He was a secret operative of the War Propaganda Bureau, which was called Wellington House during World War I. And the whole British media, including literary figures like H.G. Wells, as well as newspapers and all forms of media, were very, very tightly controlled by the War Propaganda Bureau. And apparently this control continued after the war. It was supposed to just be a wartime measure, but it continued after the war, and I think probably still functions in much the same way to this day.
Mm-hmm.
Where
is that control, like, would you say it comes from the crown still, or would you say it's kind of relinquished to families? I'm curious from that standpoint too, because like there's talk of, the monarchy is, and I apologize that I'm taking you a little bit off target. We're definitely going to get to the because this question's come up a lot. That's why I'm asking. Like the monarchy, like we talk about, there's been a lot of talk of it being just a monarchy in name and not really in function. I guess, is it the monarchy doing these things, or is it just related to families in the UK? Like powerful families is what I mean.
Well, my working hypothesis right now, Jeremy, is I'm starting with the idea, and which in some ways is the most conservative and most likely idea, which is simply that the same people are in control now as were in control 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or even farther. Now, this could be wrong, but so far it seems to be panning out, because we have been propagandized to think that the old aristocracy, the nobility, the royalty, and that's who I'm talking about, is the old ruling class, whom we were led to believe by people like Karl Marx, among others, that these people supposedly lost their power. Marx said there was a bourgeois revolution in which self-made, newly rich, middle-class people rose up, and through their native cunning and thrift and hard work and greed, somehow just made so much money and got so good at it that they just completely wiped out the power of the old ruling class. And we have highly successful TV programs like Downton Abbey, whose very purpose is to propagandize us with the idea that this happened. The whole purpose of Downton Abbey was to say, look, after World War I, what was left of the aristocracy was, they all went broke. They were utterly annihilated. They're all gone, just like Karl Marx told us that it was going to happen.
So interesting.
What is it?
No, it's just like, because so my wife, like one of the shows she's obsessed with, and she's watched every episode in the movie and everything, is Downton Abbey. So I never looked at it through that perspective. That's a really good point.
Well, yeah, I mean, to me, it just hits me in the face. I enjoy that show very much, but I just always see the propagandistic angle to it, and it's very clear they're trying to say, oh, these poor aristocrats, they all went broke, and now their chauffeurs are marrying their daughters, and these things.
Well, I appreciate you humoring me on that, Richard. So I guess, because we get questions a lot on YouTube related to that particular topic. And I guess then bringing us back around to the book title, because you had mentioned, looking at communism as an invention of the British intelligence agency. So how does that connection happen? And how does that? I know there's a big connection to Lenin as well. So I guess what does that look like?
Well, actually, it's a continuation of the very subject we're talking about.
Okay.
The I call it the persistent power of the aristocracy, because what I believe the intelligence services serve the aristocracy, and what happened in England during the Industrial Revolution, when of course all these people left the countryside, they became industrial workers. Men, women, and children were forced to work long hours under horrible conditions. There was a great deal of suffering on the part of industrial workers and their families, and they very legitimately objected. And this is where socialism was born. But the first thing that the first response of the British establishment was a movement that was called Young England. And this rose up in the 1830s and 1840s. And Young England was a movement of landed aristocrats who were saying all these evils of the industrial age are caused by the greedy, money-grubbing middle class. And we were never like that. We aristocrats, when we controlled everything, we were not greedy. We lived on inherited wealth, and we had a bond with our serfs and our servants, and we took care of them, and they always had a place to live, they always had work, and we loved them just as much as we love our hounds and our horses, and we always took care of them. And it will be better if we go back to that. So this was called the Young England movement, and I believe it still continues to this day. It sort of went underground. They don't call it Young England anymore, but we find the same ideas continually popping up amongst these elite movements, especially on the left in Great Britain. The same idea keeps popping up, that the landed aristocracy are the embodiment of British virtue and are the natural leaders of left-wing movements. And this began right at the beginning with Karl Marx. Now Marx, interestingly, had a familial relationship, a family relationship with the British aristocracy. He married a woman whose father was a Prussian baron, and his mother, I believe, was a Scottish noblewoman who was descended from the Earls of Argyll and had some kind of relationship with the Stuarts. The Stuarts. So she was of the high nobility of Scotland, and she was, if I got this right, she was Marx's grandmother. So he married into a very, very high-level family of nobility, who are often not described that way in Marx biographies. They'll say he married into a member of the minor Prussian nobility, and et cetera, et cetera. But his grandmother was actually of the high nobility and had royal connections in her genealogy. So he married into this very early, and it's not exactly clear how or why. There's a lot of stories, some a little contradictory, as to how this all happened. But interestingly, when he came to England, and Marx came to England after the revolutions of 1848, as did many revolutionaries, he was kicked out of several countries in Europe for his subversive activities. And the mecca of revolutionaries in that day was London. They all came swarming to London because they were welcomed there. And the legend is, the sort of historical myth is that they came there because England was simply a freer country, more tolerant, and so where freedom of speech was honored, and so they could pursue their revolutionary activities without harassment in England. And that's partly true. It was more free than other countries on the continent. But the other half of that is that the intelligence services themselves and the aristocracy itself actually wanted these revolutionaries to be there under their supervision, under their guidance, under their wing, so they could be watched, so they could be recruited. And those who were recruitable and those who were found to be promising could be trained and brought into the fold as intelligence assets. And I make a case in my book that this is exactly what happened to Karl Marx, and which had also previously happened with the French revolutionaries in the previous generation to Marx. They too had been recruited by British intelligence and molded by British operatives into becoming the type of revolutionary that was wanted. And typically this meant moving them in a more violent, more extreme direction, weaponizing them so they would be more useful for the purpose of overthrowing governments and carrying out mass blood purges to wipe out the opposition. So this happened in the French Revolution. Then the 1848 revolutions happened. Marx came to England with many other revolutionaries, and he almost immediately met a Scottish aristocrat named David Urquhart, who I believe was a distant relative of his wife through his wife's Scottish line of nobility. And this man basically adopted Marx. He became his mentor and sponsor. Marx, for a number of years, wrote for his publications. He vouched for Marx. He helped him get involved with all kinds of activities that might have been difficult for him without some kind of sponsorship like that. And the funny thing about David Urquhart is that he was an arch reactionary who believed that, along with the Young England movement, I don't think historians officially call him one of the Young Englanders, but he was absolutely with their program. He wanted to return to feudalism, and he said that the evils of the industrial age were all the cause of the middle class and its money-grubbing mentality, its soulless, penny-pinching, money-grubbing nature, and that to get back to a more tolerable life as was lived in the old days of Merry England, as they called it, what was needed was to actually liquidate and eliminate the middle class, to destroy it, and to go back to a situation where a landed aristocracy was the proprietor of the country and the proprietor of the lower classes and their caretakers and their patrons. So David Urquhart wrote a book advocating this before he ever met Marx. He was an absolute diehard neo-feudalist. He wanted to go back to feudalism, and yet he and Marx became partners. And this David Urquhart was an intelligence operative. He had fought in the Greek Revolution, and he had become a diplomat. He was very close to the Sultan of Turkey. He became a kind of Lawrence of Arabia about 100 years before the Hollywood version, where he went. He was very enthused about the Turkish culture and the Muslim world in general, and he went among the Circassian tribes of the Russian Empire and stirred up a rebellion against the Russians. And he was greatly admired by these Circassian tribesmen and other Muslim tribal warriors in a very similar fashion to what we would see later with Lawrence of Arabia. So this guy, Urquhart, he was a soldier, he was a diplomat, and he was a secret agent. He was a covert agent of the British Secret Services, and he was Marx's chief sponsor when Marx came to England, and for quite a few years. And under the tutelage of this man, Urquhart, what Marx actually became famous for was not speaking out against the oppression of the working class so much as speaking out against the Russians and the Russian Empire, which was very much in line with the British imperial policy of that time, as it still is today. and was extremely helpful, especially toward British war efforts during the Crimean War of the 1850s. And this David Urquhart was the absolute leader. He was very extreme in his anti-Russianness. He absolutely loathed and hated Russia to the extent that he publicly accused the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, of being a Russian agent and being in the pay of the Tsar, simply because his policy against the Russians, Urquhart deemed to be insufficiently strict and warlike. And so Marx echoed Urquhart in all of these things. And it's very, very interesting. He was known at that time, and he wrote, that is, Marx wrote not only for Urquhart's journals in England, but he also wrote for an American newspaper, which his name I always forget, the New York Sun or the Globe or something. It was the Horace Greeley's paper. It was the largest, most widely read newspaper in the English-speaking world, and Marx was one of their top writers. And what he mostly wrote about was the evils of the Russian Empire and how we must all stick together against the Russians. This
feels like such echoes of today. Like all we hear about is Russian disinformation and things like that. It just seems like times don't really change.
Well, yes, and I discuss this in some depth in my book, that the anti-Russian policy of Great Britain goes back more than 300 years. And they have always, ever since Russia first emerged as a world power in the 17th century, the British have been extremely wary of them because they recognized that Russia was going to be an obstacle to their ambitions in the East. The Russians were expanding westward into Europe. They were expanding southward, ominously towards India and into the Middle East. And especially the southward expansion was very dangerous to British interests. The British had India there, and they had the trade routes that led to India and to China. And keeping control of the Eastern Mediterranean was always the most important key to British imperial strategy and its economic strategy as well, which are the same thing. And so Russia was the great threat to the Eastern trade routes, because if the Russians could take Constantinople, if they could take the Dardanelles Strait, that meant they could move their fleet at will into the Mediterranean and challenge British power. So for more, 200 to 300 years at least, the British were absolutely obsessed with backing the Ottoman Empire against Russia and trying to prevent the Russians from taking Constantinople. And I go into this in some depth because it's very important to understand why the British eventually found it necessary to overthrow the Tsar and to utterly destroy the Romanov dynasty in Russia. It was the culmination of this centuries-old policy of seeing Russia as their chief obstacle to full British control and hegemony over the world, which is, of course, what they sought. And so Marx willingly took up this cause, and most Marx biographers or Marx commentators who are sympathetic to his Marxist views will usually try to explain this by saying, well, Marx saw Russia as the most retrograde country in Europe. Because of their serfdom, they still had basically a feudal system, a few landowners keeping millions of people in subjection as serfs tied to the land, and all that. But that doesn't explain, is it, why he supported, why Marx aligned himself with David Urquhart, who wanted the same thing. He wanted England to be more like Russia and to return to a feudal system. So it really doesn't explain it. And in fact, there's been a systematic cover-up of Marx's anti-Russian works and writings, which is just kind of relaxing in the present day. But maybe 100 years ago, or even less, Marx scholars would reflexively ignore this aspect of Marx. There have been biographies written that didn't even mention David Urquhart and his tremendous influence over Marx, because they just didn't know how to explain it while maintaining the fiction that Marx was somehow a free agent who was unconcerned with the British imperial policy. In fact, he was an agent of influence for British policy.
I guess looking at it then, so we have this Marx connection, which I think is interesting, but there's also the Lenin connection as well. And then I guess when we're looking at it, so how do they take this idea of communism, and then how do they, because you've mentioned through here, like in these color revolutions, the British find ways to blame it on other people. And in this case, they blame communism on Jews. Like, so how did that idea come about, and how did they end up blaming the Jewish people for it?
Well, what eventually happened in Russia, of course, we had the revolution in 1917, and some people say there were two Russian revolutions. I think there was only one, but it took part in several phases, and it wasn't complete until the end of the Russian Civil War. And the British were involved in every single phase. They were directly involved in overthrowing the Tsar. They helped the Bolsheviks get in power, and the British War Office under Churchill actually supervised the entire Russian Civil War and basically fixed it so the Bolsheviks would win. Now, in the role of the Jews in this, of course, is that the Jews in Russia were a very numerous and very powerful, aggrieved minority who had a grievance against the Russian monarchy going back centuries, really. And so when you engage in destabilization and regime change, the first thing you want to do is look at who are the different ethnic groups, who are the different interest groups, who are the different religious groups, what's their beef, what's their attitude towards the government. And so it was completely natural and inevitable that the experts at the British Foreign Office and wherever else would seek to reach out to aggrieved elements of the Jewish population and to help them build separatist and or revolutionary movements. And they did this not only with the Jews, but with every movement, every ethnic movement in Russia, which they could identify as being aggrieved. And they went to the Poles, who were then, Poland was mostly a province of Russia. They went to the Poles and said, look, we're going to help you gain your freedom. They went to the Finns. Finland was a province of Russia. They went to all the Baltic states. They went to the Ukrainians. They went to every ethnic group whom they thought had a grievance, and they fanned the flames of that grievance, and they sought ways to incorporate them into the master plan. And this is simply the science, if you will, of regime change, the science of destabilizing another country. This is what you do. This is how it's done. So when I say that the British blamed it on the Jews, I don't mean that Jews weren't involved as revolutionaries. Of course they were, obviously. But what I am saying is the Bolsheviks, who eventually supposedly overthrew the government and supposedly won a 5-year civil war in the field against the entire Russian military, against all that was left of the Russian Imperial Army and the Imperial Tsarist officer corps, and plus more than 200,000 foreign troops, Allied troops, who were supposedly landed in Russia in 1918 for the ostensible purpose of helping the Tsarist armies to defeat these Bolsheviks. And here you have to understand, after the Bolshevik Revolution, they basically controlled two cities. They controlled what was then called Petrograd, now Petersburg, and they controlled Moscow and certain areas around it, but basically a very small area in the center of Russia. And they were surrounded by enemies on every side. Poland, Finland, the Allied armies coming in from the north, from the Arctic, Murmansk, and the white Russian nationalist armies coming in from the east and from the south. The Bolsheviks were cut off from supply lines, and they were surrounded on every side, overwhelmingly outnumbered. And the British were supposedly in charge of these white armies, and really all the separatist armies, all of them. Winston Churchill in the War Office was the de facto commander of this whole anti-Bolshevik exercise, because they all depended on the British for supplies, for money, and for diplomatic cover, for the British to advocate for them in the international community. So the whole theater, the whole war theater of the Russian Civil War was controlled by the British. Now, it appears to me that Churchill was arguably, you could say, a good guy when it came to the Russian Civil War, in that it appears that he was sincerely trying to win the war against the Bolsheviks. And what he actually was pushing for was to fight the Bolsheviks to a standstill, which oughtn't to have been very difficult, and then propose some sort of plebiscite under international arbitration to ask the Russian people what they wanted to do. And he was absolutely refused this by the Prime Minister, Lloyd George. Lloyd George would not allow Churchill to fight the Bolsheviks. He wanted the Bolsheviks to win. This is absolutely a matter of historical fact, attested by Lloyd George's own statements, not only his public statements, but his private statements in meetings of the war cabinet and so forth. He was completely opposed to any restoration of the Russian monarchy, for example, under any form, even as a liberal constitutional monarchy. Lloyd George said, no, there will be no Russian monarchy. He would only supposedly allow some sort of constitutional parliamentary government of a very liberal type. And the White Russians, of course, were extremely suspicious of any such liberal government under British influence, because it was exactly that sort of government which caused the revolution in the first place. The Liberal Duma, which had been in power, sharing power, let's say, with the Tsar, was totally cooperating with the British embassy and undermining the Tsar and setting up the revolution. And so the White Russians wanted nothing to do with it. They'd seen that before. And so basically what was happening is the British government was making conditions for the White Russians that they could not meet, as the oldest trick in the world, saying, sure, if you agree not to restore the Tsar, any Tsar, under any circumstances, if you agree to have a liberal government under British control, and you know how that's going to end. And they also had to agree, Admiral Kolchak at one point, who was the supreme commander of all the White Russian forces, he was given an ultimatum that if he wanted the British to continue supporting him, that he would have to let all the separatist movements separate from Russia, Finland, Poland, and all these other territories which had previously been integral to the Russian Empire. He was told as an absolute condition, you must submit their cases to the League of Nations, which, of course, was controlled by Great Britain. And so Kolchak refused. And so throughout the Russian Civil War, which went on for 5 years, and in which an estimated 8 to 10 million people died, a huge war that most Americans don't even know happened. throughout this war, a situation was created which I call the Vietnam before Vietnam. And because for those of us who old enough to remember the Vietnam era here in the U.S., there's the same strange sense of an endless war that goes on, and that really, we ought to be able to win, but for some reason, the government is putting forth policies that don't allow us to win. And that's how it seemed, to me as a kid in the 60s. I think that's how it seemed to most Americans, that somehow, among the elites, that we were supposed to have this endless war that went on forever, and we were never supposed to win it. And so the Russian Civil War was kind of a precursor to that, was run very much the same way. And ultimately, the white forces just gave up. They were defeated one by one. Their support was cut off. And by 1921, 1922, basically the Bolsheviks won. It went on for a couple of years. To 1924, there were still holdouts in eastern Siberia, but it was basically over by late 1921. And so this entire process was supervised by the British. And what I try to explain to people, there are a lot of people who want to focus on the very large representation of Jews in the Bolshevik movement. And that's absolutely true. I don't dispute that. I concede that point right in the first chapter. There's nothing to dispute. There definitely was a very large portion of Jews in the Bolshevik movement, but it's very, very clear that the Bolsheviks had zero ability, zero power, no power whatsoever to overthrow the Russian government, and especially to slog it out with the White Russians and the Allied armies of intervention in a 5-year civil war. They had no power to do this, no skills to do it, no abilities to do it, no equipment to do it. They had nothing to do it. The only thing the Bolsheviks were equipped to do was to be intellectuals sitting in coffee houses and stabbing each other in the back in their little factional fights. This is literally the only thing they knew how to do or had ever done until the British came in and recruited them, found them useful, and started plugging them into this larger network of what we now call color revolution activity, which the British had been running all over the world since at least the time of the French Revolution. And so in this context, we see, for example, there's a chapter in my book called Lenin in London. Lenin first came to London in 1902, along with a number of other top Bolsheviks. And he made, I think, 6 visits, in many cases extended visits to London between 1902 and 1911, as did all the other top Bolsheviks. And they visited under assumed names. Certainly Lenin did. He had a fake name, and he was protected by British elites, and especially by British individuals connected with the so-called Round Table movement, which we discussed before, Jeremy.
Yes.
This was a movement of British elites. They're often thought of as left-wing elites. Sometimes they're called socialists and communists. But what they really were was liberal imperialists, they were people who mostly came out of Oxford. There was a branch of them from Cambridge in the 1870s. They were followers of John Ruskin, who preached liberal imperialism, the idea that the best way to spread the enlightened values of civilization amongst the benighted masses of the world is to conquer them, colonize them, teach them English, and basically make them part of the British Commonwealth until finally everyone is so civilized and so British that the whole world becomes the British Commonwealth. I mean, this was the vision of this roundtable movement, and it was embraced at the highest levels by very top aristocratic families and by the crown itself, by the royal family. One of its founding members was the crown prince who became Edward, who was the Edward just before World War One? Was it Edward the Sixth? I forget the
I don't know if
number.
it was the fifth or the sixth, but it was somewhere in that line.
Right. You know, the one who was very portly, and he went to Paris, and well, anyway, he was one of the founding members of this roundtable movement before it was called the Roundtable. There were three men: Cecil Rhodes, a journalist slash intelligence asset named William T. Stead, and then a man named Lord Esher, who was actually a front for the Crown Prince. And these three men met, I think, in 1891 and formed a secret society, which has become the subject of Carroll Quigley's writings. And a lot of people have studied this because Carroll Quigley popularized the subject, and it's very well known. It's often thought of this movement as a movement by Cecil Rhodes, but Cecil Rhodes was actually a very young man. I think he was only 23 years old when he wrote his first famous will, in which he put forth his so-called vision of conquering the world, bringing the United States back into the British Empire, and et cetera, all these ideas that he was later known for. And yes, he could have been a prodigy who somehow, like Alexander the Great or someone like that, somehow had this vision of world conquest at the age of 23. But I tend to be skeptical about that sort of thing, especially within the British system, where they like to raise up people as public fronts to put forth certain ideas and say, oh, look how brilliant this young man Cecil Rhodes was. But I think the Rhodesian ideas were actually the ideas of the British elites themselves, the top level oligarchs, if you will. And certainly the Cecil family, as even Quigley makes a point of in his books, was very important in backing this whole Cecil Rhodes movement, this roundtable movement. And these were the people who, that is the roundtable people, backed by the crown, backed by top aristocrats like Cecil. These were the people who brought Lenin and the other Bolsheviks to London and actually hid them from the police. Mm-hmm. And they didn't have to hide them very far because the police had already been told to look the other way. It's very interesting. And there was a man named Philip Whitwell Wilson, who was one of these people. He was tied in with this roundtable group of supposedly left-leaning liberal imperialists. Lenin actually stayed in this man's house. He was a guest in his house on his second visit to London in 1905, while the 1905 revolution was playing out in Russia. So there's just a great deal of suspicious going back and forth of these Bolsheviks to London. And we're often led to believe that their haven was in Switzerland, which was partly true, but they spent a lot of time in London, and it's very clear that they were following in the footsteps of the French revolutionaries, the revolutionaries of 1848, Karl Marx himself, and then finally the Bolsheviks. All roads in this revolutionary business lead to London. London is always established and held out as a haven for revolutionaries on the run. It is there they can find friends, they can find supporters, they can find people who will talk turkey with them and make arrangements with them and figure out how they can be fit into the larger scheme of British-sponsored color revolution.
And I guess you got a good smile out of me there when you mentioned Alexander the Great. The book I'm reading right now is called Alexander the Great by Philip Freeman. I was obsessed with Alexander the Great in undergrad, and that's actually Roman emperors emulating Alexander is actually what got me into studying Rome in grad school. But I guess looking at it, Richard, like given this information and given this idea, I guess how does this change like our future outlook, or how does this change how we operate in the future, like, I guess, given this data and given this understanding?
Well, I think in the most general sense, as Americans, I feel that Americans especially need to learn this secret history of the special relationship, our real history with England. I don't think we're taught what our real relationship with Great Britain is in the present day, or what it was from the very beginning. I think when we learn American history, we're not even taught what the real causes were of the revolution. We're taught it was the tea tax or the Intolerable Acts, but these were just the provocations that happened at the very end of a long process. And the real issue between the colonies and the crown was economic liberty. It was the fact that the colonies were not even allowed to carry on any kind of manufacturing for export, or to export anything to other countries except England. And we had this huge growing empire of 13 colonies.
That was the wild part about it too. I finished a biography of George Washington not long ago, and they were talking about, like, before the revolution, like how he would buy suits, and it was like interesting so much. Like, they'd make all the raw materials here, they'd ship them to England, make them into the product, and then sell them back to us. It, like, just seems like really backwards.
Right. It was really backwards, and it was also very disadvantageous because the raw materials were cheap, and the manufactured goods were very expensive. And this, of course, is the old mercantile relationship, which supposedly is no longer in force anywhere in the world, but it really is. It's hidden better, and it's hidden behind different fronts and different layers of other nationalities and transnational institutions. But I think the same scheme is still going on, where certain countries are simply not allowed to manufacture and other countries are allowed to manufacture, and this gives them a great advantage. And who really makes all the money at the back end? I mean, we think of China today. China is now the workshop of the world. And how did this happen? Well, it's very clear it happened because the Anglo-American elites decided that China was going to be designated to be the great manufacturing power of the world, and then they enacted policies to make it happen. And this was not for the good of the American people. It was not for the good of the Western world. Sometimes we were told it was for our good. Oh, you'll get all these high-quality products so cheaply, and we won't have to pollute our own country. We'll have clean water, clean air, and the Chinese will have all the pollution. Won't that be wonderful? But now we have the World Economic Forum telling us what to do, and telling us that we're never going to be able to manufacture, and telling us, oh, you don't need cars, and you don't need homes, and actually you don't really need to own anything at all. You can own nothing and be happy. And so this is not what we were promised, but this was the plan. We're going back again to a condition of serfdom. Mm-hmm. And once you see how this plan to reinstall feudalism and serfdom has been pushed so persistently, especially by British elites, and how it is part and parcel of the whole globalist plan, including the supposed left-wing part of this plan, right from the very start, which is the French Revolution. That's really the start of communism. What we now call communism today began with a guy named Gracchus Leboeuf and his so-called conspiracy of equals. He was one of the French revolutionaries who broke away. He became more extreme, and he was under British mentorship, British guidance, influence of British intelligence fronts. The whole familiar pattern becomes very familiar when you research these revolutionary movements. He was stopped and he was executed, trying to overthrow the French revolutionary government because they weren't revolutionary enough. But Marx and Engels later acknowledged this Leboeuf as the first modern communist. because he preached the need for a violent revolution and the abolition of private property, and just all kinds of ideas that later we came now associate with Marxism, but they preceded Marxism by quite some time. And all of these things from the beginning were all of these movements can be shown, and I show them in my book as having been influenced and manipulated, and in some cases controlled by British intelligence. So it's all part of this worldwide network of color revolution infrastructure that the British have been skillfully and expertly creating for at least 200 years, and which they still operate to this day, I believe, with the help of their faithful servants, the United States of America. That's how I see it. Some would disagree and say that America is the head of the snake and that Britain is simply a lapdog who takes orders. But when you look at how our present situation developed in a linear fashion, you look at the timeline, you look at what the British plans were for globalism, how globalism was going to work. I mean, their plan from the beginning was that the United States was going to do all the heavy lifting as far as wars and, enforcing the peace, being the global policeman. So the fact that we now are a global policeman, some people think, oh, that means we're the global hegemon. But that was the British plan from the beginning. That was exactly what they wanted, to make a permanent military alliance with the U.S. so that the Americans would be obligated to enter any war that the British decided to enter. And there wouldn't have to be any prolonged negotiations or pressures put on them, on us, to enter a British war, as happened in World War I. There was some difficulty. And then after the war, we wouldn't go into the League of Nations. So the British were always very frustrated by American independence. The fact that we had a very strong sense of independence and we had the economic self-sufficiency and the military means to enforce our independence. To the British, this was always a problem. What they wanted was a humbled, chastened America that understood it was just one country among many, and that we must work together with the global commonwealth and not try to rule the roost. And so British policy since that time, since the beginning of this globalist movement, has had two edges to it. One is to cultivate the U.S. as the big brother and the global policeman who carries out all these military activities, all these wars, which is our job in the new global order, but also to humble America. And I argue in my book, and I actually take this from another book by Sean Stone called The New World Order, fantastic book, which I cite in my new book. But he discovered that Henry Kissinger, he traced Henry Kissinger's intellectual lineage, that he was mentored by a guy named William Yandell Elliott, who was a Rhodes Scholar and an early member of the British Roundtable. He was American, this guy Elliott, but he was one of the earliest Americans recruited into the Roundtable in 1919. He went to Oxford. He served in the U.S. military, and then after the war went to Oxford, got a PhD, and became a leader of the British Roundtable movement worldwide. And he was Kissinger's mentor. He recruited Kissinger as a graduate student into the CIA in 1951. But both of these men, Elliott and Kissinger, maintained relationships, very close relationships with the British Foreign Office and the British government, to the extent that it could arguably be called improper, that their loyalty as U.S. intelligence officers was arguably compromised by the closeness of their relationship with the British government. And there is a whole lineage of these men. And this is something I pointed out from my book, drawing on the work of Johnny Vedmore and Sean Stone, who really put this whole lineage thing together. But what I showed is that if you take Lord Alfred Milner, who was the founder of the Round Table movement, he took over from Cecil Rhodes in 1902, and Lord Alfred Milner was also the War Secretary of Britain during World War I, who traveled to Petrograd and delivered an ultimatum to the Tsar saying, Tsar Nicholas, you are going to be overthrown by a revolution if you don't do what we say. And what they wanted him to do was lay down his autocratic powers and turn over all power to the British-controlled Duma in St. Petersburg. And the Tsar said, no. Milner said, you're going to be sorry. He went back to London, and I think it was just a week later, the Tsar was overthrown. And this was not a secret. It was broadcast all over the British newspapers that the Tsar was overthrown because he didn't listen to Lord Milner's wise words, and so he got what he deserved. And then things went from bad to worse in Russia from there. Now, this Lord Alfred Milner was the key. He was the leader of this Round Table Imperial Federation movement, as they called it. He mentored a guy named A.D. Lindsay at Harvard. Lindsay mentored William Yandell Elliott, this American who went there in 1919. Elliott mentored Kissinger. Kissinger mentored Klaus Schwab and helped Klaus Schwab to start the World Economic Forum back in 1971. It was called something different. But so what Vedmore and Sean Stone have shown in their work, and which I have explained in my latest book, is that Klaus Schwab, this guy who until just a few days ago was telling us how to live and that we were going to eat bugs. And that
going to eat the bugs.
Yeah, exactly. He was a Round Table guy. He was in a direct mentorship lineage going directly back to Lord Alfred Milner, the guy who gave the ultimatum to the Tsar. So this group of people is very tightly organized. It's a small group, and they stick together, and they all working together. And some of them are British, and some of them are Americans. But the British run these programs through Oxford, through other institutions. They run these programs of what they call soft power. And the British brag about being the leading soft power on earth, where they recruit people, often when they're very young, often by getting them to go to school in the UK, as I know you did, Jeremy, but I still like you. No, just kidding.
It was only a year, so I guess I didn't spend that long there. Well,
No,
Rich,
just kidding.
I really enjoyed this conversation. We definitely have to have you back on again, because I feel like I learned so much every time I talk to you, and I really enjoy the conversation too. I also have a new character from history. I now have to research this Gracchus LeBoeuf as well, because I'm curious if that's his. I'll have to research this, but I'm curious if Gracchus was actually his birth name as well, because the Roman Revolution 133 to 31 BC is started really by the actions of two brothers, Gaius and Tiberius Gracchus. So I'm wondering if that's a callback to that. But so once again, it is a callback to that. Okay, there we go.
Yes.
So once again, the book is called How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. Our guest today has been the author, Richard Poe. Richard, where can we find the book? Where can we find you, sir?
Well, it's on Amazon. Well, I have a website, richardpoe.com, and I'm on the X platform at Real Richard Poe.
Very cool. Well, once again, everyone, thank you for joining us, as I know this was a guest back by demand because all of you loved his previous appearances, and we'll definitely have him back again. So a reminder to like this video, leave us a comment, smash that subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. We'll catch you guys next time.